Start?
Yeah. Okay. Greetings. My name is Adnan Khan, and I'm Director of Community Awareness.
This is Shafi, and I'm the Secretary of IPAC USA.
We are your moderators for the socioeconomic effects of COVID-19. Businesses, communities, families, and the youth were all impacted socially or economically in some way. It's vital for all of us to come together and discuss the unfortunate economic and social effects the pandemic has had on several lives.
To discuss these effects, we have Zamaan Qureshi, who is a freshman at the American University majoring in international relations and political science. He has his own YouTube channel called Discussion is Good, focusing on international issues, and is also the director of social media for the Real Facebook Oversight Board. Next, we have Pham, who is a junior at Northwestern University, majoring in economics. Finally, we have Nada Hentati, a sophomore at Loyola University of Chicago, majoring in chemistry.
To kick off the discussion, we ask, what social sectors do you think need the most attention during COVID-19?
I can start. So first of all, thanks to IPEC for hosting this event. I think this is a really critical discussion that we need to be having right now. The youth of the world need to be involved in the discussion around how COVID has impacted all of us. From my perspective, I think being someone who follows the news quite closely in politics, I think for me personally, I've seen the greatest effect in communities of color by COVID-19. It's disproportionate in the healthcare access, in the ability to access testing, and these are problems around the world that I think we are still looking for solutions for.
I completely agree with that. I think the most important social sector is obviously like health and making sure that everyone has some sort of appropriate health care that they can access in cases like these of emergency. But also, I think something else that's really important is obviously a lot of people have lost their jobs, and making sure that everyone can eventually get back to like economic stability is also really important. So I think another really important social sector, is like social welfare.
Yeah, for sure. Going back to the point that minorities are in particular like socially vulnerable, I think minorities are definitely vulnerable because of their housing. Some people from racial and ethnic minorities live in very crowded conditions, and this makes it more challenging for them to follow prevention strategies. Going off of that, minorities, occupations, people from racial and ethnic minority groups are disproportionately represented in essential work settings such as healthcare facilities, farms, factories, grocery stores, etc. And I think that's another reason why minorities are affected disproportionately.
Yeah, I'll just expand on that by saying we need more, I think, intervention from governments around the world, but particularly in the United States, as we all live in the United States, for communities of color to support communities of color, not only in health, but in jobs as well. We've seen record numbers of unemployment, and just this summer we at Discussion is Good had an analysis of how communities of color have been affected in terms of those who continue to use public transportation. So the disproportionate number of people who continue to use the CTA, for example, in Chicago, has been communities of color. So these communities are putting their lives at risk to continue to go to work every day and provide for their family, and the government needs to intervene in continuing to pass stimulus packages in order to make sure that these people can live on their feet.
Off of that point, I think you made a really important point with like the essential workers and transportation, but I think something that a lot of governments need to take into consideration is, for example, when they make curfews where people can't go out and they shut down the CTA after, let's say, like 8 p.m., a lot of essential workers rely on that transportation to get home. So that's also impacting them. So it's a really complicated situation where, like, you know, there's like people who need to be out and people who really don't.
Yeah, I think the government is definitely trying to help these people out, obviously, as we see from like all these stimulus packages that Trump is putting out. However, I think I read that it has helped about like 1.5 million workers. And although this is like a large number of individuals, it's still not enough. And I think like a way to help this package be more effective is that it should be more targeted. I know a lot of people that I know that are more on the higher income level have gotten like stimulus packages. And from this perspective, like I know higher income people tend to save more of that money rather than spending it because they don't really need it. So I think a way that the government can be more productive is to target people who actually need it rather than just like giving stimulus packages to everyone.
Those are all really good points. What are your thoughts on the financial impact pandemic had on small businesses?
I think it's really unfortunate because a lot of small businesses were hit. Obviously, and for a small business, it's already really hard to, you know, like succeed and everything like that because people tend to lean more towards bigger corporations. So I think it was really devastating. I know it's really personal for me. Like my favorite cafe in the city shut down because they couldn't sustain themselves during COVID, and so I think it's really unfortunate.
Yeah, and as we kind of have to scale back because of the rising cases, which is partly due to the fact that we haven't had a strong national response or national guidelines implemented around the nation, we see that a lot of businesses are kind of falling back or regressing to those points that we saw maybe in in March and April, and unless we kind of find that balance between what are the best measures we can take from a public health standpoint, but also continuing to be able to fund our small businesses. I mean, a big way that people can help is by supporting their small businesses, getting takeout where they can from local restaurants, continuing to shop at those places, because the big corporations are ultimately unaffected in the grand scheme of things from a profit level by COVID-19.
Yeah, something I found really devastating was that from February to April 2020, the number of active business owners in the United States dropped by 3.3 million or 22%. And this drop in active business owners was the largest on record. And I personally know many people who I'm close with, who have been mentors for me all my life, who have lost their small businesses and their dreams were almost like torn apart. And it's really sad to see that. And as you said, Zamaan, it's really important to support your small businesses.
Yeah, I think I kind of have like a personal experience on this. I know Northwestern students are stereotypically known to not like tip their Uber drivers or their Grubhub workers. So I think a way that, students like me who like have the privilege to even order food sometimes, like it's very important that we utilize our privileges and, do our part to our community by not only like tipping our workers, but also restaurants.
But your experiences, restaurants were shut down, parks were closed, tourist sites were sealed, air travel was halted. Do you guys miss going out? And how do you think we can ensure that we get these businesses back and open in a safe way for everyone?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like just like any other college student, of course we miss going out. But I think what I noticed for my school in particular is that we have very good testing. Like everyone gets tested at least once or twice a week. And I feel like the more we get tested, the more I feel more comfortable either hanging out with friends who are also tested. So I think this is definitely an active way to ensure that, people make responsible decisions when going out and things like that.
Yeah.
I completely Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I completely agree. I also think it's really important for businesses to make sure they're keeping themselves they are like keeping themselves accountable is what I meant to say. Because I know downtown in the Loop, a lot of bars, for example, have been really packed, and so I think that's really taken a toll on the cases right now in Illinois, which are at record levels. And so I think businesses have to hold themselves accountable, so that we can reopen sooner rather than later. Because by packing people in, it's going to end up just having more harm.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds simple, but we just got to follow the public health guidelines. They're in place for a reason. Our top health experts in the United States and in each of our individual states have said very definitively what those are. Unfortunately, not everyone is following those public health guidelines. And I think part of the reason is we've seen the politicization of what is or isn't an effective public health measure, and that's unfortunate in that we now exist in a world where public health guidelines can be political, and that's it's incredibly concerning if we are going to kind of rally together as a nation, as a world, and combat this disease.
You know, personally, I've seen that, like Zamaan said, like stuff like masks and social distancing has completely been politicized to the point where, you know, it's dividing our nation. So this leads to our next question. In your opinion, has the pandemic united or divided the nation?
I mean, I can start with that one. Yes, it has completely divided the nation. You know, we've seen in previous cases in the United States where crises have brought us together momentarily, but that's been short-lived, and especially throughout COVID, as perhaps lockdowns have gotten stricter because of the spread of the virus. The country has been splintered, and for us at the Real Facebook Oversight Board, I mean, we've been tracking disinformation for quite a few months now, not only associated with COVID, but if we do not have the same understanding of what is fact, how can we agree on what are the effective public health guidelines? I mean, I think it was in April when the director of the WHO said that COVID-19 disinformation is spreading faster than the virus itself. How can everyone agree on wearing a mask if people are seeing false information on Facebook telling them that masks don't work?
I completely agree, and I feel like that ties back to the whole just politicization of wearing masks. I think it's important that everyone knows the difference between fact and fake, and like listening to scientists and the importance of scientists. So I really appreciate the work that a lot of the people at Facebook headquarters do that, you know, stop this disinformation, because I think it's really important.
Right, and while Facebook has, you know, taken some steps to try and curb that, I think the company has been a vast majority complicit in a lot of the spread of this dangerous misinformation. The company hires content moderators to review information, but at the end of the day, these people are low-paid workers who are enforcing Facebook's guidelines for what is considered disinformation or fact or fiction, not what perhaps the health guidelines are saying. And you know, maybe Facebook has done a bit of a better job recently, but the company continues to be complicit in this spread of disinformation.
Yeah, so I know we touched on this a bit before at the beginning of the discussion, but what do you think the pandemic has demonstrated about the abilities of our government?
I can start with that. I think the government has lacked at times the scope or the ability to take necessary measures. We are, grateful and so enshrined in our Constitution and our separation of powers. But at the end of the day, when it comes to public health crises, we need a national response. I mean, COVID-19 does not respect borders. We've seen that from the very beginning. We all know that, yet we continue to hear mixed messages from our government administrations, from states and individual states, and frankly, we can talk all about disinformation spreading on Facebook, but if it comes from the White House, for example, then how are we supposed to kind of rally or unify a national message to curb the spread of this virus?
Yeah, going along with that, I think to some extent this pandemic shows how too much freedom can kind of be bad. I think our society is too individualistic. As you guys mentioned before, how people think wearing a mask is a choice, not a necessity. And if we compare this to other countries who got, COVID under wraps in the beginning, for example, China or Korea, where once they said, oh, wear a mask, people wear a mask. I think that just shows the differences in culture between American culture being very too individualistic and people thinking too much for themselves compared to other countries.
Yeah, when Johns Hopkins started to track the data in March, they said that the United States was the best placed country to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. And here we are in November with over 220,000 people dead in the United States. And we have not followed the public health guidelines that we need to.
I completely agree. And I wanted to take kind of a positive spin-off in all of this, because I think for me personally too, it's really hard to know really how much of an impact the government has on us. But I think COVID-19 has really showed all of us that the government is really necessary and how much responsibility the government has on us as citizens. And so I think that's obviously shown too with the record high voter turnout this year that's happened. So I think a lot of people are starting to recognize how important and crucial the government is in their role in things like a pandemic.
Like Zamaan said earlier, COVID, it doesn't have any boundaries. And but specifically, how do you think that COVID has impacted communities of color and minorities? Because why I ask that is because, for example, the Black community, they're more at risk for COVID because of underlying conditions and stuff like that. So how do you guys think that COVID has impacted communities of color and minorities?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. The issues that continue to face communities of color are cyclical. They're intertwined. So when one aspect, for example, you are laid off from your job, then you lose access to healthcare, for example. Then you lose access to a steady source of income. That means that you're not putting food on the table. That means that you don't have the money to necessarily go and buy a lot of masks, for example. The issues that face communities of color are not only that they don't have access to quality healthcare that higher income communities have access to, but also just kind of basic necessities. It's honestly, there's a huge wealth discrepancy in this country, and that is exemplified and amplified by the COVID-19 crisis.
So, Talking about the youth and unemployment, I know we talked about unemployment before. We have seen unemployment on a massive scale during the pandemic. New research shows that more than 1 in 10 people aged 16 to 25 have lost their job, and just under 6 in 10 have seen their earnings fall since the coronavirus began. So, had you seen people around you, specifically the youth, losing their jobs and steady income? How do you view that experience? And please share any personal experiences you guys have.
Yeah, of course. For me in particular, I don't know of any youth that was particularly affected. However, I've seen people of all different ages and experiences affected by COVID-19. I guess to share some personal experiences, my aunt lost her job. She works in the oil industry, and I don't know if you guys remember, like in the beginning of the pandemic when no one was really driving, oil prices stooped down to like one of its lowest in history. And so that's just one example of, one of my family members losing their job, but also I think people in the healthcare industry are also very affected. My uncle, who's an anesthesiologist, has actually had like shorter hours because they're only doing like critical surgeries and things like that. And my third story to share with you guys is that my aunt and uncle also opened like a sushi shop. And obviously that was like probably not the best timing. They struggled a lot in the beginning of the pandemic, but luckily due to the fact of like people from the city moving to the suburbs, this has actually kind of helped their business in the end. But yeah, those are some of the stories of people losing their job around me.
Yeah, I mean, from a student perspective, I think, not everyone necessarily has the ability to pay for college. People rely on jobs while they're at school to pay for their education. And COVID-19 has forced a lot of those individuals out of jobs. And ultimately, it's difficult for those individuals to fund their education. So that's when intervention needs to come in from places like
gap years and just, not being able to afford going to school this upcoming quarter or even next year. And I think, yeah, you're definitely right. There's some government intervention that needs to be held because otherwise there will be a huge gap in education among younger students like us.
Yeah, and I think it just,
continue. Finish your, yeah.
It just continues to exemplify the existing issues that we already have in the United States. I mean, COVID-19 has exposed a lot of problems, but these problems didn't just come up because of COVID-19. They have exemplified and shown what has already existed and what we haven't tackled in this country. So going into 2021, we can't kind of play around with this. We need a government that addresses all aspects of this pandemic.
I 100% agree with that. And to finish this discussion, how do you see the socioeconomic effects of COVID-19 in your communities and families?
For me personally, I think my community and the school that I go to is kind of like a bubble. I remember during orientation, they took a poll on each student's socioeconomic status, and apparently 60 to 80% of my class was designated themselves as middle to upper class. And I think I definitely see this being true in my daily life. I still see people going, eating out all the time, buying things off of Amazon all the time. And I think it just definitely shows the privilege of both my school and, the bubble that I live in. But I think this bubble is definitely breaking, and that people, are beginning to realize their privilege and, how it relates to COVID-19.
Yeah, and I think for me, I feel the same. I mean, I live in a kind of bubble as well. It's a wealthy community, but at the same time, even here, you see the impacts of COVID-19. I mean, one thing when we moved into complete lockdown, when schools shut down, a big discussion or lack thereof initially was how do students who are on free and reduced lunch get access to food in our community. And so it's a community-wide impact that it has, and not everyone necessarily realizes the impact of that. The other thing is that we unfortunately have seen these demands to reopen schools fully. Yeah, you know what? We need to get students back in quality education, but at the same time, we have to follow our public health guidelines. And as a graduate from Hinsdale Central is overcrowded right now. It's pre-pandemic. It can't support fully reopening. And so the kind of measured approach that is being taken right now of the hybrid model that has affected the community, people are upset about it, but it's necessary to help continue to curb the spread of this virus.
I also
I
think
appreciate. Sorry, you can go.
I was gonna say I think it's also really hard to generalize what like youth think about the COVID-19 and its socioeconomic effects, because in some areas you see a lot of youth taking it very seriously, but I think in other areas you see a lot of people who aren't taking it seriously and putting their communities at risk. And so in general, I think it's really difficult to really make a generalization.
All of your input so much. Aiden and I loved hearing all of your personal stories and your perspective on socioeconomic effect the pandemic has had on all of our communities. And I thank you guys for being here, and I'm really happy about all the topics we talked about and the discussion we had. Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome.